rain poured relentlessly over the streets of Columbus, Ohio, casting a shimmering veil over the city. It had been a long day for Vice President JD Vance, filled with back-to-back meetings and speeches, but as his motorcade rolled down Broad Street, something caught his eye. A lone figure huddled beneath the awning of a closed convenience store. The dim streetlight barely illuminated the man's gaunt face, but JD's sharp instincts told him this wasn't just another passerby lost to misfortune. "Stop the car," JD said abruptly. His security detail hesitated. "Sir, we're on a schedule." "I said stop." The convoy came to a slow halt. Ignoring the puzzled glances from his staff, JD stepped out into the rain, his polished dress shoes splashing against the wet pavement. He pulled his coat tighter against the cold, but his focus remained fixed on the man sitting on the sidewalk. A battered cardboard sign rested against his knees, the words hastily scrolled, "Once a teacher, now forgotten. Anything helps." Something about those words sent a chill down JD's spine. He stepped closer, his heart pounding in a way he didn't quite understand. The man's clothes were layered in mismatched fabrics, his hands raw from exposure, his head bowed as if the weight of the world pressed down on him. Then, as if sensing JD's presence, the man lifted his face. JD's breath caught in his throat. He knew that face, weathered now, thinner, exhausted, but unmistakable. Memories came rushing back in an instant. A chalkboard lined with bold, sweeping letters. A voice brimming with passion as it spoke of great literary minds. A reassuring hand on a young boy's shoulder. "Mr. Mitchell?" JD's voice barely rose above a whisper, but it was enough. The man's bloodshot eyes flickered with something between shock and recognition. His cracked lips parted slightly, as if struggling to form words. "JD!" he rasped, disbelief thick in his voice. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The years, the circumstances, the sheer impossibility of this meeting weighed heavy between them. But JD knew one thing. This wasn't just a coincidence. Fate had placed them here for a reason. For a moment, JD Vance stood frozen, rain trickling down his face, his breath caught somewhere between shock and disbelief. Mr. Mitchell, his high school English teacher. The man who had once commanded a classroom with effortless authority, whose passion for words and stories had made literature feel less like a subject and more like a world waiting to be explored. JD could still remember sitting in the back of that classroom, struggling to believe he had a future beyond the factories and hardships of his hometown, until Mr. Mitchell showed him otherwise. But now, he was barely a shadow of the man JD remembered. The sharp suits and neatly knotted ties had been replaced with layers of mismatched, threadbare clothing, his coat worn thin against the biting cold. His once steady hands, always holding a book or scribbling notes in red ink, were raw and cracked, the skin weathered from too many nights exposed to the elements. His proud, booming voice, the one that used to fill the halls of Middletown High with energy and conviction, was reduced to a hoarse, broken whisper. How had this happened? JD swallowed hard, his mind racing. How does a man like Mr. Mitchell, one of the best teachers he had ever known, end up like this? The rain continued to fall, drumming against the pavement, but neither of them moved. Mr. Mitchell blinked, his sunken eyes flickering with something JD couldn't quite place at first. Recognition, but also something deeper. Shame. He quickly looked away, his fingers tightening around the frayed edges of his coat, as if trying to pull himself together, to hide whatever remained of his dignity. "JD," he said again, his voice quieter this time. I can't believe it's you." JD crouched beside him, ignoring the cold water seeping through his clothes. "What happened to you, Mr. Mitchell?" His voice was gentle, but the weight of the question pressed down on both of them. The older man let out a hollow laugh, one that held no humor, only exhaustion. He exhaled slowly, his breath visible in the night air. "That's a long story. He hesitated before adding, "You shouldn't be seen talking to me like this. You're the Vice President of the United States." JD shook his head, his gaze unwavering. "And you were one of the best teachers I ever had. That still counts for something." Mr. Mitchell let out a slow breath, shaking his head as he stared down at the wet pavement. "Not anymore," he murmured. The words hit JD harder than he expected. Not anymore. This was a man who had shaped young minds, who had taught students to believe in themselves, to see past their circumstances. JD himself had once been just another kid from a broken Rust Belt town, feeling trapped by his circumstances, unsure of what the future held. But Mr. Mitchell had changed that. He had made JD believe in the power of words, in education, in the idea that a person's story wasn't written in stone, that they could change it, shape it, own it. And now here he was, believing that he no longer mattered. JD clenched his jaw, pushing down the frustration that burned in his chest. He wasn't about to let Mr. Mitchell fade into the background. Not now, not ever. He stood up and extended a hand. "Come with me," he said firmly. "Let's get out of this rain." Mr. Mitchell hesitated. His fingers twitched, hovering just above JD's outstretched hand. For a moment it seemed as if he might refuse, as if the weight of his own pride was too heavy to let him accept help. Then, slowly, he shook his head. "I appreciate it, JD, really, I do." His voice was rough, tired. "But I don't want to be a burden." JD's jaw tightened. He had heard those words before. From veterans, from single parents, from struggling workers who had been pushed aside by a system that forgot them the moment they slipped through the cracks. But Mr. Mitchell had never been the kind of man to ask for help. He had always been the one offering it. "You're not a burden," JD said, his voice unwavering. "You mattered to me back then, and you still matter now." Something shifted in Mr. Mitchell's expression. Just a flicker of the man JD had once known, breaking through the exhaustion and despair. Slowly, hesitantly, he reached out and grasped JD's hand. As JD pulled him to his feet, he felt a deep sense of purpose settle in his chest. This wasn't just about one man's struggle. This was about something bigger. About a society that let its educators, its mentors, the very people who shaped the next generation, slip through the cracks. As they walked toward JD's waiting vehicle, a silent understanding passed between them. The road ahead wouldn't be easy. There would be obstacles, challenges, and setbacks. But JD knew one thing for certain. He wasn't leaving Mr. Mitchell behind. Not now, not ever. Second chances aren't just about resources. They're about someone believing in you when you've stopped believing in yourself. Teachers spend their lives lifting others up, but who lifts them up when they need it? Who was a teacher or mentor that made a difference in your life? If you could say one thing to them today, what would it be? Drop a comment and share your story. The warm air inside the car was a stark contrast to the cold rain still pounding the streets of Columbus. JD Vance stole a glance at Mr. Mitchell, who sat quietly in the passenger seat, his hands resting uneasily in his lap. The man looked out the window, as if he still couldn't believe he was here, dry and warm instead of curled up under a storefront awning. JD could feel the tension in the air, the hesitance, the pride, the unspoken shame of a man who had once stood tall, but had since been beaten down by life. As the car pulled away from the curb, JD spoke first. "Let's get you somewhere safe for the night," he said. "We'll figure everything else out in the morning." Mr. Mitchell exhaled, nodding slightly. "I don't want to cause any trouble, JD." JD shook his head. "You're not. You helped me when I needed it. Now it's my turn." JD arranged for Mr. Mitchell to stay at a small hotel downtown. It wasn't anything fancy, but it was clean, warm, and most importantly, a step toward dignity. When they arrived, JD handed him a key card and a small bag of essentials, new clothes, a toothbrush, some toiletries. Mr. Mitchell hesitated at the doorway, his fingers brushing against the frame. "It's been a long time since I've had a door that locked," he admitted, almost to himself. JD's chest tightened at those words, but he kept his voice steady. "Get some rest, Mr. Mitchell. We'll talk in the morning." The door clicked shut, and JD stood outside for a moment, staring at the number on the door. He had faced a lot of difficult moments in his life: poverty, war, the ruthless world of politics. But something about this hit deeper. This wasn't just any struggling man. This was his teacher, a man who had shaped him, a man the world had abandoned. The next morning, JD hit the phones. He reached out to local shelters, housing organizations, and employment services, but he quickly realized what thousands of struggling Americans already knew. The system was not built to make things easy for people trying to get back on their feet. No ID, no housing. Without a driver's license or social security card, securing a long-term place for Mr. Mitchell was nearly impossible. No address, no job. Without a stable living situation, finding employment was a major challenge. Bureaucratic red tape. Every phone call led to another agency, another waiting list, another barrier. After hours of frustration, JD rubbed his temples and let out a heavy sigh. How did we let it get this hard? How did we create a system that keeps people down instead of lifting them up? Later that evening, as JD sat across from Mr. Mitchell at a diner, he leveled with him. "It's going to take time, but we're going to get you through this." Mr. Mitchell stirred his coffee absently. "JD, I appreciate what you're doing, but I don't know if I can get back to who I used to be." JD leaned forward, his voice firm but kind. "You don't have to be who you were. You just have to believe that you still have something to give." Determined to cut through the noise, JD turned to something that had always worked for him: his platform. That night he posted on social media, sharing the story of the teacher who had once inspired him and now needed help. "Mitchell changed my life. He believed in me when I didn't believe in myself. Now it's my turn to believe in him. If you've ever had a teacher who made a difference in your life, I ask you to help. Let's get him back on his feet." The response was overwhelming. Former students commented, sharing their own stories about Mr. Mitchell's impact. Strangers offered donations, job opportunities, legal assistance. Within hours, the story was spreading, and JD realized something important. This wasn't just about helping one man. This was about fixing a broken system, one life at a time. The morning light streamed through the hotel window, casting soft shadows on the walls. Mr. Mitchell sat on the edge of the bed, rubbing his hands together, still adjusting to the idea that he had a safe place to sleep, even if only for now. He had spent years bouncing between shelters, park benches, and the unforgiving streets, never imagining that one of his former students, now the Vice President of the United States, would be the one to help him find his way back. JD Vance, standing near the door, watched him closely. He knew that getting Mr. Mitchell off the street was just the first step. The real challenge was helping him believe in himself again. "Let's take this one day at a time," JD said, handing him a cup of coffee. "First things first, we need to get your ID back." Mr. Mitchell let out a dry chuckle. "You'd think that'd be easy, but without an address, without proof of who I am, it's like I don't exist." JD took a deep breath. He had spent the last few days making calls, talking to local organizations, pulling every string he could. The bureaucracy was a nightmare. The system didn't make it easy for people like Mr. Mitchell to start over. But JD wasn't one to back down from a fight. "We'll get through it," JD reassured him. "I've lined up a meeting with a local nonprofit that helps with documentation. They'll walk us through the process." The following days were a whirlwind. With JD's help, Mr. Mitchell navigated the labyrinth of paperwork to get a new ID, opening doors that had long been closed to him. He was connected with a healthcare provider, started receiving basic medical care, and even got fitted for a new pair of glasses, his first in years. But the real breakthrough came when JD introduced him to the director of a local community center. "They have a mentorship program for at-risk youth," JD explained as they toured the center. "Kids who need someone to believe in them, just like you believed in me." Mitchell hesitated. "JD, I haven't been in a classroom in years. I don't know if I have anything left to teach." JD turned to him, his voice firm but kind. You never stop being a teacher. Those kids don't need someone perfect. They need someone real, someone who understands what it's like to struggle and still keep going." The words hung in the air between them. JD could see something flicker in Mr. Mitchell's eyes, not just doubt, but the possibility of hope. A week later, Mr. Mitchell stood in front of a small group of teenagers at the community center. At first he was nervous. His hands trembled slightly as he gripped the marker, staring at the blank whiteboard. Then instinct took over. He started talking about storytelling, about the power of words, how literature could be a window into the soul, how every great leader, every powerful thinker had once been just a person with a story to tell. The kids leaned in, listening. By the end of the session, one of them, a quiet boy who had barely spoken, raised his hand. "So, you think my story matters?" Mr. Mitchell smiled. "I know it does." As weeks passed, Mr. Mitchell found himself not just surviving, but living. He started tutoring at the center full-time, helping students with reading, writing, and life skills. Parents took notice. The community took notice. One day, the director of a local charter school approached him with an offer. "We need a teacher like you, someone who sees the students for who they are, not just their circumstances." When Mr. Mitchell told JD about the job offer, his voice was hesitant, almost disbelieving. "Do you really think I can do this again?" JD clapped a hand on his shoulder. "You already are." The journey wasn't easy. There were setbacks, moments of doubt. But Mr. Mitchell had found his way back, not just because JD had helped him, but because he had rediscovered his own purpose. And JD? He had always believed in second chances. But seeing firsthand how one act of kindness could ripple outward, changing not just one life but an entire community, that changed him too. Months had passed, and Mr. Mitchell was no longer the man JD Vance had found huddled in the cold that rainy night in Columbus. He stood tall again, not just physically, but with the quiet confidence of a man who had rediscovered his purpose. In a packed auditorium at a community event on education and second chances, he stepped onto the stage, the applause from students, teachers, and parents washing over him. JD stood at the back of the room, watching with quiet pride. "I thought my story was over," Mitchell said, his voice steady but emotional. "But what I've learned is that no chapter is final unless we choose to stop writing. And sometimes when we've lost our way, it takes someone else believing in us to help us believe in ourselves again." The crowd erupted into applause, and JD felt a lump rise in his throat. This wasn't just about helping one man. It was about proving that no one is beyond redemption. Society often turns its back on those who fall through the cracks, especially people like Mr. Mitchell, once respected, now forgotten. But what if instead of walking past, we stopped? What if instead of assuming someone else would help, we chose to step in? JD had spent his career talking about the struggles of working-class America, about the cycles of poverty and hardship. But this experience had shown him something even deeper, that the difference between despair and hope isn't always policy or programs. Sometimes it's one person choosing to care. Mr. Mitchell's journey didn't just change his life. His return to teaching meant dozens, soon hundreds of young minds would be shaped by his wisdom. His story, once a tragedy, had become a testament to resilience, proof that second chances aren't just possible, they're necessary. And that's where you come in. How many people in your life have helped shape you? A teacher, a mentor, a friend. What if they needed help now? Would you recognize it? Would you step in? If this story moved you, leave a comment below. Share a memory of someone who inspired you, and more importantly, think about how you can be that person for someone else. Because sometimes, the smallest act of kindness isn't just about helping another person, it's about rediscovering our own humanity along the way.